Although the talk has been advertised as a talk about torture, and it's certainly going to be a lot of talk about torture. I hope the talk isn't torture to you, but the book that I'm talking about and the subject that I'm talking about is really something broader and grander than the physical application of torture to human bodies, which has been a besetting sin of the human race for as long as we've been around. It was not an invention of the Inquisition, although the Inquisition raised it to a fine art and set an example that has been copied again and again over history. I will talk in using the historical Inquisition as a framework for the subject of torture. I want to say that my book and my talk today is about the Inquisition, but it is not about some remote point in history in the distant past. The Inquisition and the tools that it used, including the use of torture, is a subject full of shock and surprise. There are a lot of counterintuitive aspects to this story. A lot of conventional wisdom about this subject is wrong. Virtually everything I've written on the subject of religion is an attempt to debunk the myths that we live with about religion. And it is a rich collection of ironies, which I will touch on as we talk together this morning. One of the things I have to work against, perhaps this morning as well as in my book, is the relegation of the Inquisition to the realm of parody. Nowadays, when people think of the Inquisition at all, they tend to think of a Monty Python skit. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. Or the scene from Mel Brooks' History of the World, Part 1, with kick-dancing Dominicans and Jews on slot wheels and making fun of one of the great tragedies of history. It's a funny, these are funny episodes, but the Inquisition was no joke. There were countless thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of men and women, and I'm sorry to say children as young as the age of 7, who were under the legal jurisdiction of the Inquisition as it existed, were subject to arrest and torture and execution. The hallmark of the Inquisition is execution by burning the victim to death, which is itself a form of torture, torture with the certainty of death at the end. And that's what the Inquisition really did in the real history of our world to real people. There's a quote in my book from the great historian of the Inquisition, Henry Charles Lee. He was to the Inquisition what Edward Gibbon was to the fall of Rome. And he wrote with rich irony, Satan himself might well smile at the tribute to his power in the endless smoke of the Holocaust of the Inquisition, which was intended to bear witness to the triumph of the Almighty. Now, Henry Lee lived long before the word Holocaust took on the meanings that it has for us, but that's not an inappropriate word to use, because I'm going to make the case today that what began with the Inquisition nearly 800 years ago was repeated again and again through history and served as a model specifically for the crimes against humanity of Nazi Germany. In fact, what I'm talking about today is something that I call fancifully the inquisitorial toolbox. The Inquisition, as a historical episode, invented a series of tools, some of which were literal physical tools, those instruments of torture which were applied to human flesh, but tools that were also less palpable, tools that consisted of ideas about humanity, about ideology, the use of fear as a weapon against one's enemies, the assumptions about human conduct and the extent to which human beings can be made to not only to act the way someone wants them to act, but even to believe what someone else wants them to believe. These are all instruments in the inquisitorial toolbox, and what I'm suggesting is that once this toolbox was fully outfitted in the early 13th century, it never went out of use, even when the Inquisition itself disappeared. That inquisitorial toolbox has been cracked open and put to use in Nazi Germany, in Stalinist Russia, and even in this American democracy at certain dark periods in our own history, the Salem witch trials, the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, the Hollywood blacklist, and most recently the war on terror under President Bush. All of these are examples of the use of that inquisitorial toolkit, not excluding, of course, the use of torture. These similarities between the historical Inquisition, as it existed many centuries ago, and events of the much more recent past, and even our own, the world in which we live today, these similarities are so striking that in 1937, when Cecil Roth, a great venerated Jewish historian, published a book about the Spanish Inquisition, as it was going to press, he hastily added a new preface. This is the summer of 1937, in order to advise his readers that the book was in fact a work of history and not a parody on current events in Germany and Russia. This was the moment at which the show trials were going on in Moscow, the moment at which Nazi Germany was purging itself of its own internal opponents and gearing up for the events of the Holocaust. And those events are so strikingly similar to what had happened in Spain in the 15th century that Roth needed a disclaimer. And of course, the ultimate irony for us, sitting here comfortably today in this beautiful setting, is that the inquisitorial toolbox has been put to use in recent years, and we have no way of knowing, may still be put to use. It was used at Abu Ghraib, it was used at Guantanamo, it was used at the secret prisons of the CIA. And when we ponder that diabolically lighthearted phrase, waterboarding, which sounds like a form of sports and recreation, what we're really talking about is one of the primary tools of the inquisitorial toolbox put to use by men and women in American military uniforms in our name, in the name of the American people. Now, I want to give you, I hope, a few surprises, maybe a few shocks as we spend time here together. You may think you know all you need to know about the Inquisition. Perhaps you do know all you need to know. But I'm going to try to surprise you just a little bit. Let me start with a few surprises. First of all, the Spanish Inquisition, as famous as it is, or notorious as it is not and was not the Inquisition. It was never anything more than a branch operation, kind of the Spanish franchise of a much larger institution that came into existence centuries earlier and operated all over Europe, or at least Catholic Europe, and wherever Spanish and Portuguese conquistadors traveled around the world. So that we have to look for the beginnings of the Inquisition, not in Spain, but several centuries earlier in southern France, in 1233, when the very first friar inquisitors were summoned by the Pope in Rome and sent to work to persecute and exterminate a community of dissident Christians known as the Cathars. You may have heard of them as the Albigensians. This is part of a phenomenon that included the so-called Albigensian Crusade. In fact, it's the aftermath of the Albigensian Crusade, where the Pope preached a crusade against Christians along the model that he had used against the Muslims in the Middle East, in the Holy Land, and found that it was ineffective in eliminating this group of dissident Christians, and so devised the Inquisition as a way of establishing a permanent tribunal, a permanent program of terror designed to eliminate from Christianity anyone that the Pope deemed to be unworthy to live there.